In return.
What I was really proud of for this particular piece is the simplicity and my willingness to just, it's okay if it's really just one brushstroke, and being okay with that as opposed to trying to do way too much with it. And there was a strong Saturnian theme in this particular painting as I sort of sat there with the paint watching it dry, allowing gravity to sculpt the shape of the drop. So that drop, those two drops you see actually kind of stick out. So I bring up this painting just to show that any thought that we do, it's always a work in progress. And anything that we create, it's a culmination of a certain journey, but at the same time, it's just the start of a totally new chapter as well. So my topic is going to be about commerce and consciousness and how these two things have evolved together to reach where we are today in the present moment. So the first section is called The Road to Now. So I see consciousness and commerce as a solar and lunar dialectic. One is at the center and the other seems to be around it. And I feel like they swap places actually. It's not just one or the other. Is commerce the body of consciousness, or is consciousness the body of commerce? And I don't think it's one or the other. I think it's both of them at different times. If you step out a bit and look at the philosophical tradition, this question comes down to, does consciousness create institutions, which is a very Hegelian perspective, or do institutions create consciousness, which is the whole Marx sort of vision of how history works. And I think connecting to PCC thinkers, Psyche and Cosmos, which is the title of Rick's book, to me also captures those two fundamental forces which have to be thought about. You can't be too much on one side or the other, or at least that's what I personally feel. So let's take a brief walk through history. These are different phases of consciousness. You have the primal, archaic, axial, modern, and postmodern. And I'm going to compare those to barter, commodities, coinage, credit, and reserve. These are the different major commercial paradigms that have worked in concert with the evolution of consciousness. So let's look at primal and barter. So the primal era starts with Homo sapiens emergence about 200,000 years ago. And you can call that a Paleolithic era. That's one way that people talk about it. And if you think in terms of Rick Tarnas's diagrams of consciousness, he'll show how the Numinous Realm is diluted in the primal era because it pervades all things. Everything has significance and meaning. But if you look at the type of commerce that was there, it was barter. So the transaction format is very concentrated because each transaction is determined by the individual in the moment. So that's where the locus of power resides. If you look at the Archaic Era and commodities, Archaic Era can roughly said to be started with the advent of farming about 10,000 years ago, or structured farming. And this encapsulates, not perfectly, but roughly the Mesolithic and Neolithic eras. If you look at consciousness, the Numinous Realm this time is concentrated in the political leadership. Right? If you are the king or the prince or the monarch, then you are believed to have divine sort of power over the rest of society. It's concentrated in the political rulers, but the transaction format is diluted because it's commodities like salt or gold or wheat or cattle. And it's a general sort of understanding that this is what we consider to be value. We go to the Axial Era, which starts with the axial prophets like Confucius and Buddha and many others around the world, around 800 BC. That's just the roughly time that we're looking at. That covers through the Bronze, Iron, and Classical era, right? This paradigm on this slide. So in this time period, I'm going to argue that the Numinous Realm is diluted because anybody is able to access it, right? You don't have to be a king to have access to God. If you follow a path, you can access it and it can be distributed. Each person is able to access it. I'm going to argue that the transaction format was concentrated because the political ruler was choosing the currency. No longer is it okay to just have a shell or a bar of gold. You have to have a coin that's stamped with a certain ruler's motto or whatever it might be. Then we move to the modern era, which takes us from around the Renaissance period, around 14th century, and this is medieval and Renaissance era. The Numinous Realm is concentrated. This is like Enlightenment thinking, where the human being is at the center of everything. Nothing else has meaning. Only the human has divinity at all. And I'm going to argue that the transaction format was diluted because the major innovation in this time was credit, right? So if you think about credit card today as a result of that kind of thinking, where you had financing and underwriting sort of determined by different banks. And it was up to different banks to determine whether you were credit worthy or not. If you're trying to sail a ship from Spain to America, is this a captain who's done it, or what's the pedigree, or whatever it might be, right? So now we look at the postmodern era, starting with the Copernican revolution. That's kind of the era that we're in right now. I think people are shifting from modern to postmodern. Somewhere like PCC is trying to move beyond the postmodern. And this is the colonial, industrial, and digital paradigms, or industrial paradigms. And the Numinous Realm here is diluted. It's everywhere and nowhere, right? Money is everything to some people. Power is everything to some people. Everyone has their own kind of religion. It could be a movie star. So it's everywhere and it's nowhere. And I'm going to argue that the transaction format is extremely concentrated in American fiat, which is the US reserve currency, which the entire world system is kind of based on what the American central bank determines. And it's completely arbitrary, actually. So I'm sort of bringing up this left-right dialectic, but also arguing that it's a spiral that through history is winding tighter and tighter. So it's not just left, right, but it's a spiral. And this diagram is from Sean Kelly's Coming Home, where he's showing conservative and liberal movements throughout history and how they're kind of tightening up into our era. All right, so that's the end of the first section. And here you'll see just this theme of things in progress, right? It's not perfect the first moment. So that very first painting, I had a collector in New York express an interest in supporting my practice. And they wanted to commission a piece just like that, except 3-4 times larger, which to me was a bit tricky because that first painting had shown up at the end of an LSD trip, towards the tail end of it, and I wasn't fully sure how I had created it. So there was, I wasn't sure how exactly I had gotten that drip in that way. So I had to create a lot of different mock-ups, and you can see here like one of the paintings I tried to do where I was trying to get some of that dynamic, but there was no drip. I just couldn't really figure out how do you create that drip. So it took a while to get that. So it takes us to now. Where are we today in terms of these questions? We can think about an integral era that we're trying to figure out. What is that about? What does that mean? How can you implement these? And I look at this diagram as a way of just two different sides trying to always reconnect, and continuously moving forward. So I think economy is the residue of activity, and vice versa. It's not just one way or the other. However you act, that's what economists try to describe and capture. So you can be doing whatever it is, and that's basically the economy. So questions are, what should I do? What am I allowed to do? How much should I receive for what I'm doing? Who is responsible for my retirement? How much economic variability in terms of net worth variability is ethical? Like, what's the right thing? Like, if you work much harder or have more talent, should you have that much more money or not? And how much is sustainable? So ethical and sustainable are, I don't think, always exactly congruent. Socialism and capitalism, I think in some ways can be described as the dilution versus the concentration of economic responsibility. So in socialism, the state manages economic affairs, right? It's up to the state to determine what should be done, how much of it should be done, and how much should somebody receive for it. And this is not I'm not being so specific, but in a very general sense. Versus capitalism, where each individual manages their own economic affairs, right? It's up to you to decide what you want to do, how hard you're going to work, and that's one way that I see this discussion about where should the responsibility be of an economic life? What features should the platform of government provide? So should everybody in this room, for example, be learning how to create products or making them, marketing them, iterating them, doing personal budgeting and accounting and investing for your retirement and for your future, right? Should everybody be learning these things, or should that just be integrated into the government platform? I think that's a question. It's a meaningful question that the answer is not always clear. I see even the Democratic and Republican debate, right? So I'm not American, but I've spent a fair amount of time in this country and just looking at the discussions happening. And I think that the Democratic position is on the dignity of giving each person security, right? That's the dignity, that's the nobility of the Democratic or liberal perspective, that each person deserves to have their food, to have the health care, to have some kind of job, right? Versus the dignity of the Republican side, which I think can be difficult sometimes in a very progressive community as ours to see. The nobility of the Republican side is the dignity of giving each person responsibility. That, you know what, you've been put here just as anybody else, and you can tie up your shoelaces and try to make it, right? I'm not saying one is better than the other, but this is just what I observe. So which one supports greater individuation? That's the question. Which is ethically superior and which one's economically efficient? These are all open questions. I think the shadow of capitalism is people left behind economically, right? People can just be like, you're not relevant, you're not productive, and go and die, or do whatever, just get out of my area. There's unchecked ecological appropriation. There's passing the buck on externalities. There are mechanistic tendencies from the Newtonian Cartesian worldview, so these are holdovers. There are monopolies. There's minimal focus on holistic well-being, so everyone is just looking at how productive and how efficient something is. And it's difficult to prioritize individuation that's unrelated to financial growth. So if you're a young bohemian person and your parents might pressure you into certain career paths because they don't perceive the value of individuating in a way that's not connected to financial reward. There we go. So how does capitalism benefit a society? I think the private ownership of creative destruction is a really big thing that people don't really think about, right? So in the past, you had a certain way of doing things, and if you wanted to change that way, the army had to come and destroy the city and remove the leader and put a new leader. Now you can break down civilization into different ecologies that can be overcome by competition and improved. And I think that's one of the good things about capitalism compared to the past. There's a dynamic hierarchy, so nothing is forever, right? If you have people who become very wealthy within one lifetime, you have families who lose their wealth as well, right? So that there's a lot of shifting that happens. It's a non-political arena for aggression. So you have this instinct, there is an archetype to want to dominate, to compete, and I think capitalism and commerce gives one avenue for this part of human nature to be expressed in a way that's not so damaging for everybody else. There's minimal restrictions on how an individual wants to contribute to society. So no one is going to tell you what you can or cannot do. It's up to you. You're free to say, this is what I am, this is what I love, let me go and do it, and let me spend my whole life refining this practice. There's a diversity of psychological priorities. So it's not just one group of people deciding gardens are important, swimming pools are not, right? It's more distributed. There's efficient orchestration of complex supply chains in a global economy, and that is something that communism failed horribly at. They just could not figure out how many jeans should I make, right? How many jeans, what style, what cut, where to source the materials from. There's a distributed process optimization, so a capitalistic society is getting better all the time in many different parts simultaneously, as opposed to some iterations of communism where they had to come up with a 10-year plan, and it's just more rigid. And I'm going to say that a powerful economic base is the foundation of military success. So the more money you have, the more you're able to maintain a force, replenish a force, manufacture this force, and research stronger ways. And if we look at World War II and the Civil War and many wars, I'm sure, which I haven't done extensive research, but this is a starting point of my thought process, that a strong economic base eventually leads to military success. And military power ensures cultural security and propagation, right? So if you don't have a strong Saturnian structure to contain your culture, there's a high chance that it might get absorbed into another entity. All right, so that brings us to the third section. And here's a more advanced prototype I had made for this collector. I mean, it's still a prototype, and I added a few elements, but you can see that after a lot of experimentation, I refigured out how to get that sweep, and there's like a drip now that's showing up, and a few different kinds of drips. And this is, I think, two and a half times larger than the first painting you saw. So I had to actually go into home supply stores and get cleaning, like the stuff you use to clean the floors, and use those as brushes to try and capture the effect that I was looking for. So now we look at the next chapter, or just some thoughts on what I imagine could happen next. So I think about after the carbon crisis, right? Obviously there's a major problem happening today with forests being cut down and global warming. Do not want to minimize that at all, but I'm just thinking about what happens after that, right? I think there's a lot of people who are working very hard in political and technological arena to solve that. So that's where I'm coming from. I'm just thinking about planet Earth after the carbon crisis. So what's the next big crisis? I imagine it to be alien contact after carbon, right? If we survive carbon crisis, alien contact is the next major Saturnian event that I can imagine, or just one of them that I can imagine. And these alien contact could be like these people, right? There's like 3 fingers, they can't really carry too many things, and they're not very threatening. There's like an ice cream on his head, right? Or it could be a colonization event, right? And as someone who's grown up in two colonial countries, India and Singapore, I wouldn't say that it's impossible, out of the realm of impossible, that this could be, at some point in time in the future, a possibility. So I use that as just a reminder that it's really important to not get too complacent as a civilization, that at the end, I don't think we want to put our future completely in faith. And I think it's important to have structure. That's just my personal take on it. So if I look at civilizational development guidelines for the planet, I think these are 5 important areas: universal basic income, meaningful narrative, sustainable industry, family choice, and weapons control. So I'm going to go more deeply into these. So universal basic income, I see this as air to breathe, right? Livelihood is impossible without income in a capitalist society. If you don't have money, you can't really do anything at all. Many humans are not able to participate in the marketplace as it stands today. In an age of robotics and AI and renewables, I think market disruption will be massive. This is probably going to happen in the next 2-3 decades. But at the same time, the cost of living might go down dramatically, because you have very cost-effective energy, and maybe a lot of systems that humans used to be involved in are no longer needed. So potentially the cost of living goes down. So that's the double-edged sword. I feel that income should be a basic right of every human if we're choosing a capitalist model, which I'm not saying is the best, but if we are, that should be the case. Meaningful narrative. I think if we become a whole Earth civilization, or even start going to other planets, which is also likely in the next 2-3 decades, it's really important to have a lot of narrative power to be able to sustain diversity without having that system break apart. So stories, like many of the people in our program are developing, I think are extremely crucial for this civilization. So I wonder, how can we foster and deepen meaningful participation in the universe? And what kind of stories unlock human motivation, courage, and sincerity? sustainable industry is crucial if we don't want to destroy our planet. I'm going to say that consumerism is one way that humanity creates and distributes its inputs and outputs. There's a lot of creativity involved, even in the Snuggie or whatever, right? There's a lot of real humans with real stories who connect with these things, but ecological destruction is unethical and myopic. It's foolish to just destroy the cell that you're living within for short term. So how do we create a life-affirming, sustainable, participatory human base? I feel like technology is part of it. I feel like culture is part of it. But kind of what Eisenstein was saying about complete deep recycling, right? You create something and then you can reuse it for a long time with cheap energy. You can keep repurposing it. So what kind of materials and processes allow us to be creative while minimizing irreversible destruction? Family choice and education. So this feels a little Orwellian, but I do feel that universal basic income is impossible without some kind of population management or conversation around that topic, right? It's impossible to give everybody the same standard of living if you have an exponential amount of people. So I just wonder, it's a question. Families should have the resources and education to support a high quality of life. And what is the best way to help families make these decisions? That's a tricky shadow, you know? Like, you don't want to be like forced sterilization at all, or like one child policy like China. I don't know. I'm not saying what's right or wrong, but I do feel that if you're going to have UBI, you cannot have no conversation around population size. And weapons control, right? So we have tremendous destructive power that we've cultivated around nuclear weapons. We live in an era when weapons can destroy the entire planet. If, you know, really, it could happen. It's in the realm of possibility. And what's the best way to promote safety while acknowledging the role conflict has played in evolution, right? So we don't want people to just tear each other apart, but conflict plays a role in evolution. So that's just a question that comes to mind. So what are ways that we can implement these ideals? And I would not say that these are the only ideals. These are just some that I brought up. And I wonder, like, or we can have more, or there can be more, but this is just a way that I'm thinking. It's not like this is exactly it. So if you think about paths to global mobilization of a certain ideology or culture or vision of how society should be, there's a few options. I see virtual mobilization, where you have a community that's not in the same place, but they're connected through culture or membership. It's easy to begin, but it's hard to create depth, right? Because you have people joining websites and dropping out of websites. The other choice is to mobilize in multiple countries simultaneously. And to do that, you're going to be dealing with a lot of different political arenas, cultures, and infrastructure. So those are the pros and cons of that approach. And if you're mobilizing through a single nation, then you become a nation, actually. And you can be in forums like the United Nations and other international groups where you have an opportunity to talk at this higher level rather. So that's just another option. So I think about all of these, and one example comes to mind is from a virtual community to a physical country is Israel. I'm not going to say that Israel was just some website before it was a country. Obviously, it's a culture that is thousands of years old. But the point is that it was a distributed community, and then they found a geographical place, and it became a physical entity that now has membership in the United Nations. In fact, over the past 50 years, there have been over 50 countries created. So it's not such a new thing for a country to be created. You have countries that are well known, Bangladesh or Jamaica, South Korea. United States is, 200 or so years old or whatever. But my main point here is that new countries are being created all the time. And I'm defining a country as a physical space backed by military assets. That's in one way of looking at it, that's what a country is. And it's not, say, that own country's military, but oftentimes they have an alliance with the United States or the USSR or Russia. So that's what keeps that physical space intact. I was thinking about the GDP of different countries, right? So China is like a $21 trillion economy. It's the largest in the world. Germany is around 4 trillion. South Africa is the 30th largest GDP in the world. It's 0.7 trillion. And you look at number 40, Singapore, is about $500 billion economy, right? So that's a larger economy than Greece or New Zealand and Lebanon, right? Just to give a sense that you can have a place like Singapore, which is actually just one city, being more economically powerful or anchored than many larger sized countries. It's been around for about 50 years. It has a major geographical blessing because you can't really see here, but it's right at the tip of Malaysia, so it's a great in between China and India. It's like a major trade shipping hub, but it's also been really well managed because there's a lot of options of where to have a port, right? So both of these have come in. Now we look at global nations and cities GDP, right? So we're looking at Singapore with about $500 billion sized GDP. You look at Tokyo is $1.5 trillion, would make Tokyo the 18th most powerful country in the world if you're just looking at Tokyo. New York is about 1.2 trillion. And on the left-hand side, you have different countries, right? So you can see Australia is about a $1 trillion economy, right? Also looking at from a population perspective, Tokyo has about 40 million people. Canada has about 35 million people. So it's just this conversation around cities versus countries and how you can have a city that has just as much influence, if not more, than many well-known countries. So I imagine if one were to start a country, what would be the benefit, right? You would have an opportunity to reimagine the political social contract. You would have a chance to try out things that, because in the United States, they reached a certain point, but is at an impasse. You have an opportunity to try out some of these ideas. You can have open immigration for people from war-torn regions who no other country wants to take them. You can say, here's a place for you to come and to work and to live. You have I imagine, kind of a third way, which they talk about in Europe, where you have right-wing economics, which is very open and liberal, at the same time with a very strong welfare state. Those two together is what I imagine could be a meaningful thing to try. And I think citizenship should be connected with or in dialogue with the means of production. I don't know exactly what that means, but I think being able to make a livelihood and being a citizen should somehow be connected. Politics and business, it's not such a clear difference. Or it is a clear difference, but they have a lot of things in similarity, where you have a way of revenue generation, you have a certain balance of power, you have a way that resources are allocated, then you have an ability to evolve, and you have membership. So membership in a political body is total, whereas in a business it's partial, right? You can be shopping at Target as well as shopping at Costco. I see in the world already just a kind of gradient between private enterprise and government, where you have state-owned enterprises and you have social enterprises. These are organizations that are doing things like energy, roads, medicine, security, education. So it's already happening, this kind of blend between politics and business. What is the difference really? So I'm going to pivot a little bit and just think about some people who have created a lot of money and applied it to developing civilization. Like a powerful person who, or a big inspiration for me is the Medici family, which played a very important role in the Renaissance and just sort of funding a lot of important artists over multiple generations. But you also have the Gates Foundation and what they're doing with eradicating different diseases. Rockefeller eradicated hookworm disease, not by himself. Of course, it was the work of a lot of scientists and medical professions, but he was a catalyst because he had that concentrated wealth. So here's a project that I'm working on at the moment. This is a company I've registered called Numinous Realm. You can see that the logo is pretty much inspired by Groff's basic perinatal matrices, which I think a lot about business development theory connected with the death rebirth mystery, and those two together. I have this idea, right? It's not like this is what I'm going to do or this is what's happening, but it's just an idea, the way I've been thinking of diverting a percentage of profits to a global defense fund, right? So this entity is generating revenue from something that it's doing. Some amount of that goes into a global defense fund, and that's invested into a diversified index fund. So that's growing at 7% a year. Every dollar that you put in is growing at 7% average per year forever. And you can have a certain percentage of that directed towards whatever goals of activism that you're interested in, right? Whether it's some of the ones I mentioned around UBI, industry, or whatever, or adding other ones like universal education, entrepreneurship training. The point is, it's a way of having sustained activism that's completely integrated between the revenue generation as well as the ideas and the implementation over long periods of time. So if you look at this idea for about over 100 years, right? If you're putting $1 into this fund for 100 years, every year you're putting $1 in, you have 7% stock market growth, you take 2% for inflation, you take 0.5% for administration, you donate 1% of the balance every year. By the year 2117, you would have put $100 into this fund. That's how much you would have put in from your pocket. The size of this fund now is $763. The first year you donated 1 cent, and the 100th year you donated $7, and over $7.71. And over 100 years, you've given almost $500 to a cause or a group of causes. And if you look at this in terms of 500 years, you would have put, so by the year 2517, you would have put in $500. The size of your fund is now $300 million. In the 100th year, you gave $7.7, and in the 500th year, you had $3 million in a sustainable system that's going to keep generating that cash for the next year as well. You have $3 million to give to whatever it is that you think is important for civilization. Over 500 years, you've given around $100 million. And that's $1 per year over an extended period of time, leveraging global growth. So I just wanted to have a slide for the shadow because I know I've talked about some pretty crazy things and some pretty big ideas, and I just want to admit completely that this is not totally fully baked, and I'm not here saying that this is exactly what it should be. I acknowledge that there are deep flaws and probably a lot of misgivings that people have around some of the things that I've discussed. I want to honor that. I just wanted to have a slide to honor that. I think, in conclusion, focused wealth can be a powerful catalyst for transformation. I don't believe contemporary capitalism is ideal. I don't think that it's the best thing that's ever made, but my personal interest or way I operate is just to look at what is possible given the available terrain. In summary, I hope to become a better business person. For various emotional and philosophical reasons, I've had a very hard time going out in the market and just making money. It's been very hard for me. As an undergrad, I studied at a business school, but I've had problems, and I think learning philosophy, learning art has helped me reorient towards what commerce actually means. And I hope to integrate that skill set and potential revenue generation with thoughtful philosophies, worldviews, and activities that will lead to this vibrant yet pragmatic future where we're not just trusting that everything will work out, but we realize that we have to be competitive because I just want to make sure that my kids' kids are safe. And here's the final painting. This was created for the collector, so it's going to be shipped to New York once I head back. And this is about 3 feet by 2 feet. I went through a lot of prototypes to get that kind of shape, get that kind of drip. Started using hair dryer because the physics of the paint changes when it's larger, so using a hair dryer to dry it, and adding a few different other elements that I'm very influenced by different archetypes. And here you can see just a bit of that process. So that's my presentation. Again, thank you so much for taking the time.